Hello again. We continue our meditations on the sacred liturgy. I would like to begin by a quotation from the Catechism, which collocates things in a wider orbit. So it is with regard to what happens in ordination. The power of the Blessed Trinity is left here on earth in the Church, and the apostolic succession is what places us in the upper room. The same power is there and is ours by what we receive and hand on. We are custodians of that which made us, that which saves us, that which washes us. We have the most precious treasure possible in our hands. We don't therefore belong to a club, but it is the mystical body, and all the power of Christ is passing through us. Therefore, there are consequences with regard to the way that we handle this most precious treasure. It's not a free-for-all. There is a profound and essential difference between the Catholic faith and the Protestant mentality. There is an element of humility. Guard the deposit, insisted Paul to Timothy, his child in the faith. Remember, he was bishop. Now, we have the fact that the Lord instituted the sacrament of orders. It is threefold. That, by the way, explains why there can be no question of ladies becoming deacons. The deaconesses that were helping in certain aspects of Christian life in the early centuries were helping essentially in the role of baptism and service. They were not part of what we understand as the order of deacons, because the word in itself means servant, minister. Diakonein is to serve. So, the way in which the fullness, which was given to the apostles themselves, would then be available over the planet through this capillary force of the priesthood, which is a participation in the fullness of the episcopacy, but it's actually not as complete and full as that of the bishops themselves, because it cannot be handed on. Therefore, what Luther had and handed on was not what we have. All that has come out of Luther cannot have the priesthood, even though he had the priesthood, but he could not hand it on. So therefore, Lutheranism is a form of Protestantism. What we have is that the availability of the presence of Christ is made available over the whole planet through the fact that the Lord wanted massively the priesthood, the presbyterate, to make this available. There were to be priests sharing in parts of the episcopal authority, but always by that authority. A priest always mentions his bishop at the altar. In the East they have the equivalent. The priest in the East cannot celebrate without the antimension, which has relics in it. It's the equivalent of our corporal, and that has to be given to him by his ordaining bishop with the signature of the bishop, and it is something without which he cannot celebrate. So the bishop then is present in the priest, and indeed we still have a vestige of that union, that unity between the bishop's own celebration and that of the availability of it on a local level by the priest, who is acting in his name locally, in the fraction when the small particle is placed in the chalice. That comes right from the early church. That goes back to the time when a part of the bishop's host was taken and handed from wherever he was to the local celebration happening in his name, but always in communion with him, and placed in the chalice there of that Mass. So, here we are. Whilst not having the supreme degree of the pontifical office, And notwithstanding the fact that they depend on the bishops in the exercise of their own proper power, the priests are, for all that, associated with them by reason of their sacerdotal dignity, and in virtue of the sacrament of holy orders, after the image of Christ, the supreme and eternal priest. They are consecrated in order to preach the gospel and shepherd the faithful, as well as to celebrate divine worship as true priests of the New Testament. So, we have that in number 1564 of the present catechism, and it is a reference to authoritative teachings preceding it, like Lumen Gentium number 28. It also has reference to Gregory of Nazianzus, so East and West are common in that. We notice how preaching and shepherding are an essential part of the presbyterate. The priest is a man for others and makes available that ministry of the bishops all over the world. So, we cannot be a priest for ourselves. There is that total orientation towards service in the ordination. We no longer belong to ourselves. Just as God the Father is never on holiday and cannot turn a deaf ear to the prayers of his creatures, so too the priest is never not a priest. And the withdrawing of his visibility as a priest in what he may not wear, that is, camouflaging his identity, is a victory for the enemy of souls. For just being visibly a priest is part of his availability as a priest precisely, that he is not in any way unavailable at any time. He can be called upon. Through the sacrament of holy orders, the priests share in the universal dimensions of the mission that Christ entrusted to the apostles. The spiritual gift they have received in ordination prepares them not for a limited and restricted mission, but for the fullest, in fact the universal mission of salvation to the end of the earth, prepared in spirit to preach the gospel everywhere. So there are references there to the part of the Second Vatican Council which is dedicated to priests, and the doctrine is something which has implications for the very mentality of a priest while he is on earth. Verbo et exemplo, by word and example he is always to preach. Therefore there can be no contradiction, such as the bad language that he might allow himself to be using, the bad habits that he might be displaying, smoking, losing his temper, road rage, whatever it might be. These are all part of his unceasing sermon. Your actions speak so loudly that I can't hear what your words are saying. We cannot say one thing and have power in its utterance in the pulpit and then contradict it by our behavior. The great Trappist who became almost a founder, it's not quite so simple, Blessed Charles de Foucauld, said, "Ce que tu as à dire, dis-le avec toute ta vie." What you have to say it with all your life. And say it he did, eventually as the equivalent of a martyr, for it was a Muslim fanatic who murdered him. All his life, at the end, was a quiet presence, adoring Christ, loving Christ, without any other words. One word was enough, love. But he was not understood. It was seen as a threat. It is, says the Catechism, in the Eucharistic cult, or in the Eucharistic assembly of the faithful, the synaxis, that's the Greek expression going back to the early church. It just means the coming together, the acting together, the action done together, that they exercise in a supreme degree their sacred office. There, acting in the person of Christ and proclaiming his mystery, they unite the votive offerings of the faithful to the sacrifice of Christ their head. And in the sacrifice of the Mass, they make present again and apply until the coming of the Lord the unique sacrifice of the New Testament, that namely of Christ offering himself once for all, a spotless victim to the Father. From this unique sacrifice, the whole priestly ministry draws its strength. Again, that last sentence is taken from Presbyterorum Ordinis, the declaration on the life of the priests in the Second Vatican Council. And there's also an echo of Lumen Gentium earlier in that paragraph. We see how the Catechism is always, in a way, crystallizing earlier documents and pulling them all together. Now, with regard to the power that we have in our hands, the power of the Church itself, the demons know it. We can interpret what happened in the 1500s as purely sociological, but the truth of it is that there were presences at work attacking, because the demons knew that if they could make unavailable the power of grace coming from the Catholic Church over large sections of the world, it would be a huge victory for hell. And so, what happened? People who were formed by the Church and had gifts were, without realizing it, being worked upon. What could have started as a movement of reform within the Church began to participate in the demon of independence of mind, that is, some form of the original sin of pride. Because when an individual, finding a following, sees that he is becoming popular and has power, the temptation to become independent is so huge that very few resist. And so it is that we find, if we examine calmly and serenely the writings of Martin Luther in his early period and those in the later period, there is a difference. Beautiful, tender words towards the Blessed Virgin, of whom we think on this day, her feast, visitation, in the earlier part, give way to language which is not pleasing to our Blessed Lady, and certainly not honouring her Son in the Blessed Sacrament. We know also that Martin Luther was plagued with fears of demonic presences. One is still shown there where he was writing in the castle, the ink that he threw at what was appearing to him. There were demonic infiltrations, it would seem. And he is reported to have answered when asked, where did he get the doctrine of what he said regarding the Mass, and he is reported to have said, from the devil. But whatever happened, the fact is that by his moment of separation from authority, he opened the door for what precisely the demon wanted: disunity, and eventually more of the same. For once the individual becomes pontiff and supreme arbiter and interpreter with regard to sacred scripture, sola scriptura, scripture alone, then the consequences will follow. How can an individual claim that protection of the Holy Spirit which was given as a guarantee to the Church as a whole? And therefore it is the Church as a whole which has that safeguard of teaching and proclaiming together. and we see the fruits. How many splits have there been? And on it will go. Closer to us, we need to be careful, for we can also get into that mode. There is a temptation amongst our own to think that we know better than authority, and we have before our eyes splits going on, and splits from splits, often in the name of orthodoxy. Humility is the only safeguard, and independence of vision with regard to the magisterium is the open door to illusion. As Vincent of Lerins put it, quod ubique, quod semper, quod ab omnibus creditur. What everywhere, what always, what by all is believed. That is the faith of the Church, and we have to believe and sing the same hymn as the centuries, not in disharmony therewith. With regard to what we have, the demons know it. It comes out in exorcism. If one observes the difference between an imam in the Muslim bloc exercising some kind of ministry of exorcism and that of a priest, either in the Eastern Church or in the Western Church, but a priest exercising that same ministry, one sees a big difference. One sees authority in the question of a person who carries the power of Christ the High Priest. The demons know the difference. The demons know, and they have to obey. And so it is that we are in our ministry engaged with front-line combat all our time upon earth. All the sacramental life of the Church is a fight against the darkness and a conquering of that same. Our worship, therefore, is not just that of an assembly, that of a club. It has to be done in obedience if it wants the full blessing of heaven. But we need also to be fully aware of an earlier calamity in the history of Christianity, and to be aware that we are in, unfortunately, a situation of discontinuity with the fullness of the divine will. For the Lord had never wanted two parts of his foundation. He did pray with insistency in the high priestly prayer for unity, ut unum sint, that they may be one. And therefore it is to the early church that we look for the model that should be ours. And we know that the Lord is trying his best to heal this first breach, that of the two lungs being separated, east and west. And recent popes have been trying their best to get us to breathe again with our two lungs. Therefore, we hear the authentic, calm voice of the Church in the texts that we have common to East and West and the early councils. And we need, therefore, to be aware that we are in a situation of being contaminated by precisely this other break of which I have just spoken, the Protestant mentality, which, because of its proximity to us, is actually damaging our thought pattern. Nowadays, the Church of the Latin Rite could learn a great deal from the Eastern churches about the way one must treat the Eucharistic Christ during communion. To cite only one of the many beautiful witnesses, here we have an ancient text. The Holy One goes forth onto the discos, that's the Eastern equivalent of the paten, and into the chalice, in glory and majesty, accompanied by priests and deacons in a grand procession, thousands of angels and servants, filled with the fire of the Spirit, go forth before the body of our Lord, glorifying it. We had this morning, accompanying the entrance, and therefore the incensation, because it was a feast, that of the Visitation, the chanting of one beautiful hymn which has come actually from the East. It's "Let all mortal flesh keep silence," coming from the Liturgy of St. James. "Let all mortal flesh keep silence, and with fear and trembling stand. Wonder nothing earthly minded, for with blessing in his hand, Christ our God is..." and so on. It talks about the way in which the light is coming, and it also talks about the burning eyes of the seraphim. It's something which is very oriental in mode, and a blessing when we use in our liturgy, for it takes us out of the happy-clappy into something beyond ourselves, and reminds us of our true nature at the altar. We are mingling with angels, and we have to behave accordingly. Anything at that point orientated towards man is out of place. And should any liturgical chant end up in some way attracting applause, it is extremely displeasing to the angels, and they weep to see it happening. For at that point, the intention has been destroyed. For the moral value of an act is determined also by its intentionality. And if there's a hint that we are looking for attention or gratified by the same, then we have robbed God of his glory. We have praised ourselves, and God has not had what was his due in church. Beauty has to be gratuitous and for God alone. It is a fundamental illness in our worship if we, by nature, are applauding each other in the house of God. It has no liturgical sense, and is, in some way, a sacrilege, which does mean stealing the sacred. In that case, we're stealing God's praise. The axiom of the Fathers of the Church concerning the way to treat Christ during communion was this: cum amore ac timore, with love and fear. These moving words of St. John Chrysostom, Doctor of the Eucharist, also bear witness to this axiom, and with fitting modesty, as if approaching the King of the heavens, receiving this holy and immaculate victim, let us kiss him, and embracing him with our eyes, let us inflame our mind and our soul, lest we incur judgment and damnation, so that we render ourselves holy and edify our neighbours. Now, we note that the Eastern churches have maintained this interior attitude, as well as this external attitude, even up until the present. The famous Russian writer Nikolai Gogol, in his little work Meditations on the Divine Liturgy, commented on the moment of receiving Holy Communion in this way: with ardent desire, inflamed by the fire of the holy love for God, those about to receive communion draw near, reciting the profession of faith in the crucified Lord. After the recitation of that prayer, each one no longer approaches the priest, but the flaming seraph. Remember, saraf in Hebrew means to burn. The faithful open their mouths to receive from the holy spoon the burning charcoal of the body and blood of Christ. A modern saint of the Russian Orthodox Church, a priest by the name of John of Kronstadt, he died in 1908, thus describes the spiritual aspect of the moment of Holy Communion, along with the gestures appropriate to it. What would happen, O Lord my God, Jesus Christ, if you made the light of your divinity to shine from your most holy sacrament, when the priest brings it in his hands to a sick person? Before this light, all who encounter it or see it would fall prostrate on the ground spontaneously, just as the angels cover their faces before this sacrament, while on the other hand, so many treat this heavenly sacrament with indifference. With regard to that, one has to be very careful when the Blessed Sacrament is being brought in the street to the sick. All possible protection must be given to the Lord of Hosts when his humility comes to his suffering servant. Some years ago, scientists had set up a new, very sophisticated instrument able to detect energy in the body. And they wanted to test it out and had permission to do so in a place where death was imminent. They wanted to examine the pattern of energy, its intensification and loss in the case of a person about to expire. So with permission, discreetly and invisibly, they set up this instrument close to the person about to die in a hospital situation. At a certain point, while all the readings were being controlled, they noticed something unexpected before their eyes, that is, as they looked at the monitor. Suddenly, an immense amount of energy came onto the screen and was moving towards the sick person. For a while it was there beside the sick person, and at a certain point the sick person, the dying person, suddenly was seen scientifically to be emitting an unexpectedly huge volume of energy and light. It turned out that what was happening at that point was that the priest, the chaplain, was coming in to give the last rites to this dying person who was still lucid. And what happened was, it was picked up by this ultra-modern machine, objectively and physically. And so it was that there was proof that there was huge power where the Lord was coming. That power was coming into that sick person and giving him truly a viaticum, that is, bread for the journey. Just a few days ago, I had the privilege of giving that to a person just before she lost lucidity, and very soon afterwards she was with the Lord. It's a great grace to receive the last sacraments, all of them together with the apostolic indulgence, in a state of complete lucidity and receptivity. One day I was in a car and we were talking quite happily, and we got eventually to the person that we were going to visit, a person who was by then in care but still fully lucid. I was quite alarmed when I discovered, after we had got there, that the person actually was carrying the Blessed Sacrament and had not mentioned that at all on the journey. And so it is that one sees what is happening now over the world. The Lord is not being protected. One has to have the same respect and fear and trembling before the pyx as one does before the tabernacle. It is the same presence. The angels are there. And it matters not whether it is one host or a tabernacle of hosts. It is the same presence, no less intense, and we have to protect that presence. The Lord is asking us humbly to honour him, to give him his space and glory. I am a king. Where is my honour? He says to us with the prophet. In an explanation of the Divine Liturgy, recently edited by the Russian Orthodox Church, one finds the following instruction given to the faithful who communicate. Those lay faithful who are prepared to receive the sacred mysteries, after the exclamation of the deacon, that would probably be the holy things to the holy ones, tagia tiagis, holy things to the holy ones, must approach the chalice with the fear of God, because they are approaching fire. They must approach with faith in the sacrament and with love for Christ. Each one must prostrate on the ground, adoring Christ, truly present in the sacred mysteries. One notices in the charismatic renewal that there is an instinct to express things bodily. I was very moved by that in France. The Masses I was present at in the ambit of the Beatitudes in France were very edifying. Nothing was spared, but it was very spontaneous. It was also interesting that they had so many borrowings from Eastern liturgy, and time just did not enter into it. It was gratuitous. And as Pope Francis put it, one does not look at one's watch during the sacred mysteries. With regard to the protection of the sacred, we need to be aware that we are in a situation now which had not even been dreamt of for 2 millennia, and still in the East is not dreamt of. And what is common to the East and the ancient West is what is common to the origin. So it is important to be aware that even the Council Fathers had not envisaged the situation that we have in our time, when a great flexibility is everywhere with regard to who handles the Blessed Sacrament and how. This is recent history, and it is not the norm, and it has been actually addressed fairly recently. It was addressed in a very dramatic way towards the end of the 90s, when under Joseph Ratzinger a declaration was brought together involving not just his own congregation, but several, indeed all the major ones of the Vatican and their heads. And then it was presented to the Holy Father, John Paul II, who made it his own by approving it in forma specifica, which is not just an appending of his signature to someone else's document, but making it its own in the form in which it is worded. It was his own. And it is this. It is the interdicasterial declaration regarding the participation of the non-ordained in the ministry of priests. And it is a document which indicates that there are very strict norms regulating the exercise of being an extraordinary minister of Holy Communion, and that where that has been abused to the point of becoming normal, it has to be corrected immediately. It has to be eradicated. It is using very strong language and attacking a point which concerns the whole Church, precisely because it is the greatest treasure that we have, and we are its custodians. It does not belong to this or that layperson to be the custodian of the Blessed Sacrament. The Church is the custodian, and the access to it is very clearly protected. And it was addressing this issue. If then there is the mentality around that it is a free-for-all with regard to handling the Blessed Sacrament, it is something that has been addressed by the highest authority of the Church in clear terms, and therefore we need to be listening to what the Spirit is saying to the churches, for it has the consequences on the life of the Church. It has consequences with regard to the faith of the Church, for in practice we believe what we see, and when we see the banal, we believe the banal. When in particular children see the profane and the ordinary, they believe the profane and the ordinary. Our language has to be total. We preach by our whole bearing and being, and therefore it is not indifferent the way that we are seen to handle our God. But a year ago or more, our bishop invited us to his cathedral to pray for vocations. It was a beautiful evening of prayer and adoration before the high altar in Mullingar Cathedral, guided by a good and holy bishop, a friend of his, the retired bishop there of Longford up there, whose cathedral, as you know, was burned. And by the way, on this Feast of Our Lady, I just put a little parenthesis. It was a huge conflagration, that burning of the Cathedral of St. Mel. It was accidental, but it was a very strange affair. But what was even stranger was the way that one part of it, under huge heat, didn't suffer at all, even though it was a very delicate material. It was pure canvas. It was a beautiful painting of Our Lady. That was the only part not damaged at all, not even slightly browned or bruised by this inferno. It was a miracle, and that has been there enthroned as an indication of God's protection through Our Blessed Lady, who still wanted this part of Ireland for herself. So this good bishop gave us this meditation, and in it he gave this little anecdote. It was that he, after retiring as bishop, was exposed to the reality of parishes as they were. For when he was bishop, he would go to a well-prepared celebration. He was going there to something which the whole parish had been waiting for and anticipating, with choir practice and all that might go with it. When, on the other hand, as a retired bishop, he was helping here and there where there was a hole to be filled over a weekend, he noticed quite a different reality, things as they were on parish level. He commented then on the way in which actually things aren't perhaps as elevating as they might be compared with what he was used to as a bishop pontificating solemnly. But then he made this remark. One day I got to this church, like any other church, to cover over a weekend, and I noticed this lady whom I knew, but I knew that she wasn't from this parish. And so I expressed my surprise when I had a word with her afterwards. And she just simply replied, "My Lord, I know this is not my parish, but I come all this way to this church by choice." "Why is that?" "Well, because when I come to this church, I have a priest who prays the Mass." Now that was the pure sensus fidelium, the sense of the faithful coming out. She had a gift of discernment and knowledge and sensitivity, and she knew that there was this help to getting into prayer mode when the priest himself was already fully engaged. That lady knew the difference between praying the Mass and saying the Mass, and it's something that people do pick up. We have noticed actually over a period that without any advertisement at all, people come from quite a long way away to the Latin Mass that we have on a Sunday here near Navan. Even though there's no choir, nothing glorious, it's just the full sung Mass with incense in Gregorian chant. But it does attract people from a long way, and often very young people, and big families. And it's quite interesting that one notices that it doesn't have the effect that priests might think it has of putting people off because it's too long. It's quite the contrary. People are actually willing to travel to have what? An experience of God and not just man, and to be isolated for a full hour in quietness where only God rules and has attention. That is interesting and says a lot without a word. It takes me back to the impression that I got when I arrived in Italy in 1995. What had happened was this: I belonged to Kinderkraut, but I had been sent in the beginning of 1994 to Italy to do further studies. I wasn't yet a priest. But then when I was out there, Kinderkraut got into trouble, and Cardinal Daly, with whom I had a chat at the time, because he was well informed, he was in Rome at the time, not far away from us in the Irish College, and he gave this advice, seeing what was ahead, the best thing to do would actually probably be to stay out there and get ordained there, which is what I did. But that meant actually getting transferred to a Norbertine monastery near Rome. But then that was the thing, what to do and how to know and how to discern. So I got there. It was in December of 1995, and I remember just being exposed to the power of something unchanging. It was not human, it was something in which the human just disappeared and was eclipsed. One was alone with God and with power. The power of the unchanged liturgy is something else. And it carried me, and I realized all you have to do is enter into this flight and you will be carried. Say yes and the graces will come. Indeed, one thing which influenced me was a picture which I had seen in the brochure which goes out, it used to anyway, a few times a year from the Abbey, a kind of newsletter. And it was a picture of a recent ordination. It was Frère Dominique who was being ordained a deacon. And it was a very moving picture, taken from the tribune, right at the top there, looking down towards the high altar, which, by the way, was still used facing the other way, except on a Sunday when they faced the people, but it's always the high altar. And there, Frère Dominique was on the ground, but he actually was using an old form of the prostration before being ordained a deacon, in which he had his hands extended, which made him look like a cross when he was lying on the ground. And indeed, he commented on that afterwards. But this was something which hit me, the power of a picture. Here was Frère Dominique, prostrate and being worked upon by the Holy Spirit, and being transformed by the power of grace coming from the upper room. And it hit me, don't make a noise, don't get in the way, just say with Our Blessed Lady, fiat, let it be, and all that will come your way as well. And so it was, the power of a picture. And so things happened. And around about ordination, I was preparing a leaflet to make into an invitation for a few friends to come to the ordination. And I think I put this on the back of it, this poem, High Mass Towards the Orient. If not, it was something I wrote about the same time afterwards, but I remember writing it at that time, and it was something which actually was the fruit of an encounter, that on that high altar, used by generations of monks before us, for the foundation was 781 AD, a very old monastery, which we had taken over then it hit me that that grace is the unchanging grace of the centuries, jumping over all those centuries from the upper room through the hands of our good Archbishop. And so I wrote this, which I will share with you, for it contains it all, and also reminds us that the language of our God is not noisy. The language of our God is peace. And it is in that cloud of peace the deepest level of man meets the deepest level of God. The two intertwine, and God has access to the will. It's not a happy-clappy, superficial encounter, but a deep fiat, which hands over the reins to God. And that is true worship, for worship only happens when the will is handed over. All the rest is throwing dust in God's eyes. It's cosmetics. The will is what he wants, and the creature worships when the greatest jewel and treasure is handed over. The will, the will, the will. So here we are, High Mass towards the Orient. High Mass towards the Orient. There is a peace upon the earth at last, and skies have time to be. There is no haste or matter great to work, for we have cast our anchor in the deep, and we have faced the Godhead in full force. We have held high the Lamb upon his throne. Nay, we did own the voice that he had not, and did bend nigh all particles, that some were better shown. For 'twas a miracle that moved my feet in distant days evangelic to this place of mighty Roman air, and I now meet in inches for my face a hallowed space, where gaze did gaze at gaze upon this land, where man alone, with you all alone, did stand. Now this all came to my mind again just this last week in Corpus Christi, because the first time I celebrated alone without my community was just near the place, near that miracle which had brought me to the Catholic faith in 1969. It was reading the miracle of Bolsena, which then was carried in solemn procession, Corpus Christi procession, the first ever, to Orvieto. And I celebrated Mass at Orvieto, and there it was moving, for without concelebrants the miracle does not happen. One is the voice of the High Priest of Christ himself, and he's depending on that necessary channel at that point. It will not happen if you are not there. It's different from concelebrating. And it was a powerful moment. And it was also a full circle, because that language of God, which was also silent, was powerful enough and made a loud enough din to get through to me in my evangelical days. That's what that is referring to. The fact is that I could see here that God himself was doing something that he would never do in an evangelical context. He was speaking a Catholic language in silence. He was performing a miracle to make a Catholic point. He was underlying and underscoring a Roman Catholic doctrine. This was too uncomfortable. And so I stopped receiving Holy Communion in the Baptist Communion, and I realized this was business. And so it is that eventually I got into contact with the local parish there in Cardiff, and it happened to be run by the Benedictines, and they had to iron out various theological questions, one of the biggest of which was, what about the Anglicans, the High Anglicans? For my best friend was becoming a High Anglican clergyman like his father. And also the Eastern Orthodox, for the Eastern Orthodox priest of Cardiff was someone I knew. In fact, he taught me to read Greek, and I was impressed by his celebration. What about these? And so they ironed them out bit by bit, indicating historically what had happened and how one cannot be in the fullness of continuity without one central element: Peter, Peter, Peter. Indeed, if one scratches the surface, one will find that, although they will not like to admit it, they are a little uneasy by the fact that they haven't got Peter in the East. Historically, they have the major patriarchates of the past: Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, and Constantinople. But that central one of Peter, Rome, they have lost. And in the early councils, there was this intuition that when Peter had spoken, they listened. And therefore, in the early controversies of Christology, they did tend to know by instinct that when Rome spoke, Peter had spoken. It was looked still upon as the area where there was a certain solidity. The reason is that in the East there was a very strong link between New Rome, Constantinople, and the political power. For the reason why Constantinople became so important is that it was the seat of political power in the eastern part of the empire, and therefore there was a problem. They had to toe the line, and that explains how, for instance, in the question of the discipline of holy matrimony, there is this elasticity in which they allow a second union before a priest in church, a second chance, out of what is called economia and epikeia, clemency, and trying one's best to work within human fragility for the salvation of souls, reality. But it is something which has historic roots, and therefore it explains how, to this day, we are more strict on this element of being coherent with regard to the gospel teaching of the dissolution of marriage being impossible if it is sacramental. So, there's more going on than meets the eye. However, having said that, the fact that they did not have the machinery which we have in the West to adapt means that they have not adapted in the same way, and therefore we see history in the East. The advantage of the West is that it is something which with time became not just Western but also Catholic in the full geographic sense of the word, and therefore is truly universal. It adapts itself therefore to various cultures, what we have now begun to call inculturation. In the East, they still have very much the notion of national churches, and when one goes to an Eastern situation, one wants to know which of the Eastern churches a person belongs to. Russian, Romanian, Georgian, Greek, and on it goes. And there is this national awareness, and they secretly do actually admire the way in which that mentality is not there in the West, that a Catholic goes to any church anywhere over the whole planet and is equally at home. This element they actually do admire. So it's not simple. However, we need to be aware that the grace of God is divine in origin, but passing through both the material and the human. And out of courtesy, God Almighty, in his generosity to help creatures there where they are at, asks humbly and politely for respect, and reminds us that this is not the human that we're handling, but that which one day will judge us. We are judged by what we handle, and if we handle God badly, we must be careful, for there will be a withdrawal of grace from our hearts if we become hardened of heart and so obtuse as to forget what we're doing on a daily basis, casually and glibly, when actually our brethren in the East still walk in fear and trembling where angels dread to tread.